I'm John Anderson. I'm a principal consultant at Network to Code, and I'm also one of the core committers of the Nautobot project that we're open sourcing today. And this section, I'm going to be talking a lot about data quality and visibility of the data within Nautobot. And if we take it back to earlier where Jason was talking about the 3 points of what we're trying to do with Nautobot, this falls under the first one again, flexibility of the source of truth for networking. So we're dealing with the source of truth data, and specifically the validation of that data, making sure it's consistent and correct. So Tom made a lighthearted but very correct peer into the world of databases and data. So what is the need for data validation? If we think about the traditional view of network engineering, we have all been there where one typo on the keyboard or one wrong line of configuration creates a bad day for us or a bad early morning for someone else. We've all been there. And unfortunately, in my experience, there's been kind of this myth that network automation solves that for us, right? That if we just implement network automation, all of that bad configuration and problems go away, right? And while there is some truth to that, it all centers around the data. And the age-old expression of garbage in, garbage out, right? So just because we have a source of truth doesn't mean that the data in that source of truth is actually correct. That's largely up to network engineers to be good stewards of that data. But what we can do in Nautobot is provide a good feature set to aid in the ability of the users to actually ensure that that data is correct and valid. So let's talk about what Nautobot specifically can do for data validation and integrity. So we support 2 main mechanisms for enforcing data validation and integrity, and those are going to be the Data Validation Core API and user-defined jobs. And there's really 2 very different kind of use cases going on here that I'm going to talk about. And it's important to note that these features go above and beyond the natural validation that exists within the core data model. And just as an example of what that means, right? Like the core data model, as we've been over, supports modeling VLANs, right? There's a natural bounded range of VLAN IDs that exist. So that would be an example of a natural validation that exists within the core API. So what we're talking about here is validation that's going to be specific to the organization that they're going to want to implement. It's just things, like naming convention for devices is one of the big ones that always comes up early on in terms of network automation. Everybody's got their own idea about how to name something. But now we have the ability to enforce when data is created and updated in Nautobot that the data has to conform to the organizational rules for that data. So let's talk about the data validation core. This is part of the plugins API. This is a feature that exists within the plugins API. So to make use of it, developers and organizations are going to be creating plugins. And if we reference back to the earlier presentation where I talked a little bit about the plugins API, you don't have to go crazy with a plugin. You don't have to write millions of lines of code just to get something to do data validation. You can do essentially what you see here on the screen in terms of code and a little bit more boilerplate just to get a plugin up and running to do custom data validation. So this would be an example of within the plugins ecosystem of something like a lightweight extension that as an organization we're adding on top of Nautobot to enforce our validation rules. So what is the validation core? It exposes an interface for custom validation logic that's written in Python. And specifically, we're leveraging the Django ORM. And that is because Nautobot is a Django project. The ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. What it really does is abstract away the raw SQL queries that are being run under the hood and make sure you're just dealing with natural Python objects and so forth. But try not to go too much into the code here. But basically, this opens the door to a vast number of different use cases. We talked about relationships earlier, where we can build dynamic and custom relationships within the data model of Nautobot. Well, with this custom type of validation, we can validate across those relationships. We can form extra types of validation. And what's also a little bit nuanced in here, and people may not realize this, because we're writing just custom Python code, we can actually talk to external systems with this. So if you've got another source of information, another tool that you're using that might be relevant to data validation needs, like maybe if you're provisioning a new circuit, you want to actually go out and talk to a provider or something to make sure that the circuit ID that's being put in is actually valid. That could be a use case that your organization might want to implement. You can absolutely do that with this feature. Capacity constraints is also really interesting to me. So if you have a set capacity for a rack or a set capacity for a site, you can prevent people from adding additional resources in that context and so forth. And obviously tons and tons of more use cases. This specific example that you're looking at here, if anybody's been kind of staring at it, this shows validating a device host name specifically to the context of the site that it's been assigned to. So what it's actually doing is taking the name of the site that device has been provisioned within Nautobot and validating that the host name of that site contains the name of the site. So that if you try and create a device that doesn't, start with the name of the site that it's been deployed in, that won't be valid and it won't let you actually create that data. So we can actually look at one other example here. This is another example that we have. This is kind of a site custom validator. This is just a very simple example of something that you can do with very few lines of code is make sure that site names in this case don't contain any of these special characters. So kind of a trivial example, if you will, but shows the power of how this works. And we can show that in action if we try and create a new site. So if we say site number 1, the hashtag or the pound symbol was in that list of restricted characters. So if we try and create this site, it won't let us do that. It says site name can't contain the hashtag, and we've been denied that. And what's really key here is that this functionality extends not only to the web UI, but also to the REST API and also to the Django ORM. So if you have custom jobs, custom scripts, and so forth that are leveraging the direct access to the ORM to create data and manipulate data, this validation is automatically applied in those contexts.
So when you're adding data to, say, ServiceNow or monitoring platforms, can you use this to sort of validate that make sure that those systems get updated properly as well? Or is that a separate process that you would follow?
I wouldn't recommend it in this context, but we do have other extensibility features in Nautobot that would be appropriate for that. Something like webhooks, I would think, would be more appropriate for that particular use case.
I think also we have a DiffSync application or plugin that could work well in that situation as well. So there's some other application that we're releasing with this launch.
I was going to comment on that too, actually, Ken. But if you combine both, you can onboard data, quality data into Nautobot, then use DiffSync to then synchronize it with ServiceNow. That way you have good quality data in ServiceNow and CMDB to have self-service forms and things like that as well.
The next one is the data validation engine. And I'll take a few moments to explain what that means and how it relates to the data validation core feature. This is a specific plugin, the data validation engine is, that we're open sourcing as well, but this plugin allows administrators to define rule-based data validation within Nautobot itself, specifically within the web UI and in the future in the REST API and so forth. So what this is a no-code solution to address certain types of validation use cases. Right now, today, as we're open sourcing it, it supports regular expression-based rules for string-based data. But we also foresee other types of validation rules that we'll be able to define in this no-code type of way. Potentially like min-max validators for numerics, being able to filter relationships and things like that as well. And again, this plugin is implemented using the data validation core feature that exists within the plugin API. But this is something that if you want to spin up Nautobot today, you can go out. This is already open source. You can install this plugin and start using this functionality today. So, you can start benefiting from the data validation core feature without actually having to write any code, right? But it is important to note that the two features are distinct from one another. This plugin just happens to use the functionality provided that I've described earlier. And so if we look at that, we have that over here in our plugins dropdown for the data validation engine, and we have some regex rules defined here specifically for the device name. So if we look at that representation, what's really neat about these rules too is you can enable them or disable them at your will. So if you're just playing around with some data, or you need to do an import of some data that you know is going to break this, and then you want to fix that data and then re-enable the rule, you can do that. You can also define, custom error messages that you want to display to users that, break the validation rules and so forth. But, just to show that in action, if we try and create a device, let's just say John's core router, obviously I don't think that would match, or that would fit well within anyone's, organizational naming standards. But, prior to this feature, this is a record that a device you could actually create, prior to this feature set coming online. So let's just pick some data here and see what happens. So because that regex rule is in place, it checked against the particular name of the name field on the device model, for instance, and ran that regular expression validation, and obviously it failed. And so it let us know that. And again, because this plugin has been implemented on top of the data validation core feature set, this validation will apply in all of the interfaces, whether that be the web UI, the REST API, and so on. So really another great feature towards data validation.
So John, how do you handle existing base that has doesn't match? I mean, it won't invalidate all your other interfaces, will it?
That's a great question. So no, so this is not only specific to this plugin, but the whole data validation core feature in itself is that it is it's not immediately retroactive to existing data. Now, if you go in after you apply this rule and you were to edit an existing device in this case and change its name, that validation rule would run again. So we have another set of features that I'll talk about for how we would actually do retroactive data validation here in a moment. So that is a great question. So this set of features is for data that we are creating or manipulating at the point that validation rule has been put in place.
Thank you.
The mantra I like to often consider here is, stop the bleeding, right? Organizations always have these issues. And if you could just stop it from right now, moving forward, that's still a huge layup.
So moving on here, so jobs. So this is specifically that feature set that I just mentioned for how we would implement sort of retroactive reporting and validation. The jobs offer the ability for users to define custom Python scripts. And what's really neat about them is that you can take user input to those scripts before their execution. If it's just a report and you don't want user input, that's fine too. You can do that. There's no requirement to take any user input, but it's quite a powerful feature to say, like, I've got this validation report that I want to run, and I only want to run it on this site or against this set of devices. You can provide that input to limit the blast radius, if you will, in that type of use case. These jobs is a great way to also provision data in a standard way, because what we can actually do is create a form that if we're creating a new POP or a new site or something like that, ask a couple of simple questions to a user, because our network design dictates the way that we should be deploying those devices anyway. So why would we want to have the users have to create all of the devices in the exact same way every single time? We could just create a form that says, what's the name of the site? How many devices do you want? Click go, and it creates all the data for you in that standard way. So in doing so, you can obviously circumvent a lot of natural data issues that are going to come up. But also that's for creating data, and that's fine. But the really powerful feature of this is the data reporting. And one of the neat use cases that's out there is to say, if you're deploying a site or something like that with lots of devices, you can have this report run, every day, every hour or something like that, and you can watch as data is changing. So you can have that report to say, like, okay, this device is not in compliance based on the definition of this report today. Make some changes, see what's wrong with it, come back tomorrow, it'll be in compliance, and so forth. So really nice feature set there. So moving on a little bit, get data sources. This is a fun new feature in Nautobot. What we've got is the ability to actually sync specific types of data from a Git repository into Nautobot. So, and when I say specific types of data, we support, amongst a few others, the ability to sync jobs, export templates, context data. It also has the ability to expose this interface to plugins. So you'll see Ken a little bit later today make use of this to pull in configuration backups and so forth for the configuration compliance plugin, excuse me. What's also really powerful about this is perhaps a little bit nuanced is because you're storing this data in Git, you can follow Git flow standards to manage that data, resolve merge conflicts and so forth, but also for the approval flow that you see a lot of. So you hear a lot of people talk about, and even network to code, obviously there's lots of use cases where we're storing all of our network automation data in Git, and maybe it's because we're using Ansible or something like that, Ansible playbooks that are consuming that data. So network engineers, becoming more and more familiar with the usage of Git and Git flow in their day-to-day lives. So we wanted to expose the ability to actually get data into Nautobot with Git and so forth.
So when I sync, if it detects changes in my Git repository, is it natively built in here where it can kick off a workflow? And I see Ken coming off of camera, so he can jump in because I know he's waiting. Or is that something I need to script out where it detects, hey, there's a change in my repo, and now that workflow can kick off?
So yeah, it's going to depend on what you mean by workflow there.
Maybe it could be anything. Maybe I just detect a change, and I know that when I detect a change in this repo, I want to do X, Y, and Z.
Okay.
And just leave it at that. Just some simplistic use case as an example, I guess.
Yeah. So when you're syncing this data in, we do have feature parity with webhooks and change logging. So as the sync functionality picks up objects that have to be created or updated or so forth, you're going to get the hooks to fire. So you could easily have that fire off to another system and execute your script that way. It is a very interesting use case. So, I think that's something that we could explore internally to kick off, other types of workflows like jobs, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking, long-term outside of you in the networking space where maybe something's picked up. I want to update my source of truth, make sure that config applies, and then fire off a webhook to, wherever and do a thing. So
absolutely.
Thank you.
The last bit that I want to talk about is another plugin that we're open sourcing. So this is not a part of core. You won't get this if you just install Nautobot today, but it is an open source plugin that we have released today as well, alongside everything else. It's the capacity metrics plugin. And what this does is it actually exposes Prometheus metrics directly out of Nautobot. But it's not just for application monitoring, which I think a lot of people, if you're familiar with Prometheus as a time series database where you're exposing, performance metrics of your application over time and being able to create these nice graphs and so forth, this is not just for application monitoring. So Nautobot does support that use case, but this is also exposing time series metadata about the actual data that's in Netbox. So all of your devices and racks and so forth. So you can actually do some really powerful things like create these graphs for capacity planning, for instance, around like power reservation at the rack level and so forth, or rack utilization availability, again, for capacity planning and things like that. So there's tons of use case and potential in there, tons of data points. And so what you're seeing here are graphs that are coming from Grafana specifically. But again, this data is going to be backed by Prometheus from the metrics plugin. Here's another really fun example. So going back to a use case I talked about earlier where we are provisioning a site, that's an operation, depending on the site size, that may take a longer period of time. But let's say, management is hounding the engineering teams. When's it going to be done? When's it going to be done? All, that kind of thing. Well, we can create a simple little dashboard for them in Grafana, send them a link, say, here you go, watch it. So what this is showing is, based on the status of the devices that are in Netbox, the ones that are going from planned state into provisioning state, and then finally into active, online state. So, it's a small intuitive feature, but can bring a lot of power to the organization.
In your regex, is there any way to pull data from Nautobot itself? For example, like site slugs or something like that for your host example? Anything like that? Can you put that in your regex to check?
So not in the plugin. However, this example is using the core API itself. So this would be writing actual Python code, but this is doing exactly what you're saying. Is it's pulling this validation is happening in the context of a device, but it's pulling the site that device is applied to and matching the host name based off of the name of the site. So that functionality is there, just not in the plugin today. That's a use case that we're very interested in adding to the plugin, though, in that kind of no-code ability.
And to add to that, the possibilities are kind of endless within the validation core. As an example, one use case is to, performance-wise may not be a good idea, but one use case is you could potentially reach out to an external system such as Salesforce or ServiceNow or something to verify that site code actually exists. So the possibilities are really endless, because it's just code at the end of the day. Again, performance-wise, it may not be a good idea, but depending on your specific business needs and use cases, it may work very well.
So using a tool like this, because we know that the network doesn't exist. Let's say it's a new deployment. What are you guys seeing as a use case where I need Nautobot as a way to automate my network, but I don't have infrastructure that exists to actually do that? What are some of those challenges? How are you guys addressing some of those challenges, and how are some customers maybe addressing those? Just as a quick, just here's how. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. So if you're here, you're basically asking more or less, how do people use something like Nautobot to get started in network automation?
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, I'm rolling into a new data center. I'm getting ready to provision all this stuff. All of my data needs to be in Nautobot, but I don't have infrastructure to run Nautobot. So do I run it from my laptop? Are you seeing that as a use case where I'm spinning it up in Docker, run it from my laptop, export the data, move it to the infrastructure once it's there, or just what are you guys seeing?
Great question. In terms of, I'll spin it slightly and hopefully bring it back to what you're going for there is, what are the options for deploying Nautobot, and how resource intensive or what type of environment do I need to deploy it, things like that. So we have, as a part of our open source release, made Nautobot pip installable. So you can just pip install Nautobot and be off and running with just that and the database to back it up, obviously. But we are working on additional methods. In the repository today is a development-focused Docker container. And we are working on methods to come up with a production-worthy Docker image that you can also deploy with. Look for that coming very soon. But in a pinch, if you wanted to take this to start using it today, you could use that Docker container to get started.